Okay, our second objective is to talk about the performance management process and to explain that process. So here I have highlighted one way to show the performance management process. Performance management as a process, keeping in mind of what we spoke about earlier, performance management is a flexible process. It's not just a system. The system typically implies that something is a bit more rigid or standardized or even bureaucratic. So this is one way to present performance management as a process, a three-step process that we're gonna look at in more detail. Typically, different authors, different researchers, different textbooks on describe performance management using a number of different steps. Some use a three-step process, some use 4, 5, 6, 7. I think the three-step process does a really good job of covering all of the areas in detail and providing a simplified way to recall, in particular, some important parts of the performance management process. So let's take a look at what this process is. The three-step process is, well, starting with A, it's a process, so it isn't really a beginning per se, but we're going to talk about starting with a performance and development agreement, managing performance throughout the year or throughout whatever cycle this process takes place, and then performance review. A, B, and C. So we're going to take a look at each of these three stages in the performance management process or cycle. Starting with performance and development agreement. So keep in mind earlier, and I'll just go back for a second here, that many times performance management was confused or sometimes equated with being just a review. That is just one part of the process, and now we will see that there are indeed other critical parts of performance management in this cycle. So performance and development agreement. When we talk about performance and development agreement, we're talking about establishing an agreement on what is to be achieved at the very beginning. So not just reviewing employees at the end and then employees are scared and unsure of what's going to take place. This sets the stage for performance management during a cycle. So we start by defining role or job requirements, what is expected of the employee, the basis for assessing performance and feedback. And expectations are typically defined in terms of job or role requirements. Where do these job or role requirements come from? Take a guess. So as we said in another session, this comes from job analysis, where we extract detailed information about jobs and of course develop our job description and job specification. So having these requirements at the very start tells us this is what employees should be doing for any particular job, and using that we can then set objectives. When we speak about setting objectives, and as you would have seen in the previous video, objectives should be set according to certain criteria. But before we get to that, there are certain types of objectives. There are, for instance, targets, ongoing objectives that can be set from the job description. There are targets that can be set, such as output, sales, cost reduction, and more. Tasks and projects, the completion of tasks to a specified date, or even behavior, examples of desirable and undesirable behavior. All of these can be certain objectives, certain times in developing these objectives for any particular employee. We may sometimes have targets for a team or tasks or projects for a team, individual behaviors we want to improve upon, for example, leadership behaviors or anything like that. And sometimes it may be a combination of these objectives that we set for any particular employee, depending on that employee and their existing performance. So what then do we use? How do we set objectives for any of these types of objectives? This is where the SMART criteria comes in. Specific, of course, meaning that the objective must be clear and understandable. The objectives must be measurable in terms of quantity, quality, money, time, any of these things or a combination of them. Objectives must be agreed and achievable. The objectives must have sufficient challenge, in other words, and not be overly challenging so as to demotivate the employee or provide too little challenge, in which case we may not be fully tapping into the potential of our employees. Objectives must also be relevant to the organization's goals, and this is something that we were stressing before. They must be tied to the organization's mission, their vision, and even what their strategic objectives are. So aligning the objectives for the employee towards the strategic objectives for the organization or the strategic vision for the next few years or whatnot. Objectives must also be time framed, that is to be completed within an agreed time scale. Okay. So having set objectives that comes from the job description, which of course is based upon the organization's mission and vision and so on, these objectives will be clearly set according to the SMART criteria and can then be used to plan performance for the employee, what is going to take place next, and then plan their personal development. So what we would expect in terms of performance throughout the cycle, and what sort of developmental activities the employee can perhaps attend to during that developmental cycle. So this is the first stage, and it really sets the stage to tell the employee that this is what is expected of you throughout this year or this performance cycle. With that stage set, do we just then review the employee at the end of the year? No, that leaves the employee sometimes guessing throughout the year, unsure of whether they're on the right track. So this stage in particular is crucial. The managing performance throughout the year is crucial to ensure that we are keeping our employees on track. So how do we manage employees throughout the year? Well, first, we should monitor employees and ensure that what we set out in the first stage is actually taking place. The employees are attending developmental activities, that the objectives are being met, and so on. Then we can measure, and this may not be as extensive as the final measurement at the end of the cycle or year, but measuring to ensure that the employee is on track for the performance that we have set out, whatever performance criteria, whatever objectives, that they're on track towards those objectives. Meet with the employee and perhaps help them to overcome any obstacles or any challenges, and to determine if standards are being met towards the objectives set. Fourth, mend. In other words, if things are not meeting agreed standards, if the employee is not meeting the objectives we would like, this is where we target it, not at the end of the year, not at the end of the cycle, but during the year when the employee meets challenges. And that's okay. Challenges are usually fine. Employees will encounter obstacles. That is not something to leave for the end of the cycle to address. If we can mend those issues during the year, it helps the employee to address these issues earlier. So mend, change, fix, take action, and then move on. So the final stage is the one that is perhaps the most frequently discussed stage, is the performance review stage. And that's where we review performance of the employee towards the end of the cycle in a more formal review performance system, so to speak. I don't want to use the word system, but a formal performance review, usually once or twice a year. So what should we be concerned about during a performance review? Certain things such as the performance review should be based on agreement between both the employer and the manager, or whichever other parties are involved. It should be based on agreement. Okay. Performance review should also be rooted in performance and strategy. The performance review, in other words, should aim at achieving employee behavior and attitudes that support the organization's strategy and goals, which would have come from the first stage. So again, this should be tied clearly towards our first stage where we had the performance and developmental agreement. This point is perhaps one I should emphasize. Performance review, at the performance review stage, depending on what we use to evaluate performance, something we will discuss later, these measures should be reliable and valid. So I just put a brief diagram here showing when measures can sometimes be unreliable and unvalid. And of course, we spoke about reliability and validity in another session before. Reliability, of course, meaning that results are consistent over time, whereas validity means that we're measuring what we intend to measure. Results can be consistently wrong over a period of time, but we want results to be consistently right. And that's where we talk about reliability and validity. So what am I referring to when I talk about reliability and validity here? I'm talking about measures that we may actually use to determine how the employee is performing and at what level they are performing at. These measures, we'll take a look at some examples later on, but keep this in mind that the measures should be reliable and valid, measuring what we intend to measure, those objectives that are linked to the organization's strategy. Specific feedback. Feedback from too many sources or sometimes too much feedback from various sources can lead to information overload and leave the employee unclear of what is expected of them. So these expectations of the employee at the end of the cycle of the year should clearly communicate to the employee that these are some of the things we discussed during the agreement and even during the year. This is what we would expect from you. This is what we were expecting, and this is what you achieved. Here's some clear feedback on how you met those expectations. Right? Positive reinforcement, which of course helps the employee and is linked to our earlier point about performance management, one of the purposes being to motivate employees. So when we're talking about performance review, I think one of the major misconceptions of performance review is that we should just focus on what the employee needs to improve and perhaps their deficiencies. But what is equally as important, if not more important, is to also emphasize what the employee has done well based on the earlier performance and development agreements and what we have shown them throughout the year, to congratulate them and tell them, good job, hey, you excel in this areas or these areas or this area, and you have improved here, thereby improving their motivation, increasing their motivation to actually continue improving their performance. Finally, performance review should be a dialogue, and I cannot stress this enough, because sometimes performance review is viewed as being this one-way communication system, when it is actually more of a process that involves dialogue where both persons can contribute and even show their own evidence and communicate and discuss ways to actually help each other. So in a way, the employee will be developing themselves, and of course contributing to the organization's performance, thus helping the manager as well. This is the 3-step process of performance management. Does it look much different to what you thought about before you came to this session? I would hope so, because in many cases, previous ideas or concepts of that we may have had, or notions we may have had of performance review or performance management, was this just focused on that review part. I hope by illustrating the importance of performance and development agreement and even managing that performance throughout the year, you can see that an effective performance management process must incorporate these 2 vital stages in addition to just the performance review. What I'll do now, I'll post this video, a URL for it, and I'll post some questions on this video. Well, actually, this is the only question I wanted to ask. With reference to the performance management process, explain how you would improve the performance review in the video. So I'll attach that with some questions and just move forward. So we have covered our main objective, which was to describe the performance management process. We'll now move on to our third objective in the next video, which describes the sources of performance information.